In October 1873, in the industrial hamlet of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, construction workers excavating for a new railway bridge made a discovery that would haunt the community for generations. What began as routine digging through the abandoned grounds of the old Harwick Grain Mill quickly transformed into one of the most disturbing archaeological finds in American industrial history. The first sign something was amiss came when James Morrison's shovel struck what he initially thought was limestone. Upon closer inspection, the weathered surface revealed itself to be human bone, specifically, a femur that had been crushed and mixed with grain husks, creating a grotesque composite that had calcified over decades. Within hours, the excavation team had uncovered the remains of at least 47 individuals, their bones pulverized and integrated into the very foundation of the mill. The victims' forensic examination would later reveal ranged in age from 14 to 38 years old. All showed signs of being alive when the grinding began. Most disturbing of all, each skeleton bore evidence of systematic preparation. Tendons severed to prevent escape, jaw bones dislocated to muffle screams, and fingers broken in identical patterns suggesting a methodical approach to incapacitation. For 31 years, these horrors had remained buried beneath tons of grain and flour, the mill's true purpose hidden behind its reputation as the region's most productive grain processing facility. Records of the mill's operations had been mysteriously sealed in 1842, following a fire that destroyed much of the administrative building. A fire that investigators now suspected was no accident. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came from the position of the bodies themselves. They weren't scattered randomly throughout the foundation. Instead, they formed a deliberate pattern around the main grinding mechanism, their placement suggesting they had been forced to watch others meet their fate before their own turn came. What kind of systematic evil had operated under the guise of honest industry in this quiet Pennsylvania town? And more disturbing still, if 47 bodies were found in just one section of the mill grounds, how many more victims might lie beneath the remaining structures that still stood throughout Millhaven? Before we continue with the dark secrets of the Harwick Grain Mill, if this story intrigues you and you want to explore more forgotten tragedies that shaped American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You'll be the first to know when we uncover the next buried truth from our nation's past. I'm curious. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. Has your hometown ever discovered something horrific hidden in its history? Sometimes the most peaceful communities harbor the darkest secrets, and I've found that nearly every region has its own silent mill waiting to be exposed. Only the bravest viewers, the true mystery seekers among you, will want to continue past this point. What you're about to learn isn't just another ghost story or urban legend. This is documented history, backed by court records, newspaper archives, and testimonies that were suppressed for over a century. If you're ready to discover how one of Pennsylvania's most respected industrial families orchestrated a horror that makes modern serial killers look amateur by comparison, then steel yourself. The truth about the Harwick family and their mill will challenge everything you thought you knew about American industrial progress. Let's descend together into the darkness of Millhaven's past. Millhaven in the 1840s was the embodiment of American industrial ambition. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley, 40 miles north of Harrisburg, the town had transformed from a sleepy farming community of 300 souls in 1820 to a bustling industrial center of nearly 3,000 by 1842. The catalyst for this explosive growth was the completion of the Pennsylvania Canal's western branch, which connected Millhaven to major markets in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The town's economy revolved around three primary industries: textiles, iron forging, and grain processing. But it was the Harwick Grain Mill that stood as the crown jewel of local enterprise. Constructed in 1838 by Josiah Harwick and his sons, Edmund and Cornelius, the mill represented the latest in industrial innovation. Its massive water wheel, fed by a carefully engineered series of mill races from Widow's Creek, could process more grain in a day than most mills managed in a week. The Harwick family themselves were pillars of respectability. Josiah Harwick had arrived from Connecticut in 1821 with a modest inheritance and a reputation for shrewd business acumen. By 1840, he owned not just the mill but significant shares in the local iron foundry, sat on the board of the Millhaven Savings Bank, and had donated the land for both the Methodist Church and the town's first public school. His wife, Constance, headed the Ladies' Temperance Society and was known for her charitable work among the town's growing population of immigrant workers. The social structure of Millhaven reflected the broader patterns of American industrialization. At the top sat families like the Harwicks, the Moores who owned the textile factory, and the Brennans who controlled the iron works. Below them, a growing middle class of skilled craftsmen, shopkeepers, and clerks occupied the neat row houses along Market Street. But the bulk of the population, and the mill's workforce, consisted of recent immigrants, primarily Irish fleeing the potato famine and Germans escaping political upheaval. These workers lived in hastily constructed tenements near the industrial district, often cramming multiple families into buildings designed for one. The Harwick Mill employed between 80 and 120 workers at any given time, most earning barely enough to survive. The turnover was high. Workers frequently left for better opportunities in larger cities or moved west seeking land. This transient workforce would prove crucial to concealing the mill's dark operations. Local governance in Millhaven was, as in many industrial towns of the era, essentially an extension of business interests. Mayor Thomas Brennan was Josiah Harwick's son-in-law. The sheriff, William Dunbar, owed his position to the support of the mill owners. Dr. Elias Morton, the town's only physician, maintained his practice through contracts with the major employers to treat injured workers. This interconnected web of power and mutual dependence created an environment where challenging the established order was not just difficult, but dangerous. The mill itself operated on a carefully regulated schedule. The main grinding occurred during daylight hours when the massive millstones, each weighing over a ton, crushed wheat and corn into flour and meal. Night shifts were reserved for maintenance, cleaning, and preparation for the next day's work. The mill's location, set back from the main thoroughfare and surrounded by warehouses and auxiliary buildings, meant that activities within its walls were largely hidden from public view. By 1842, the Harwick Mill was processing grain from farms as far away as 50 miles, its reputation for quality flour making it a preferred supplier for bakeries in Philadelphia and New York. The family's wealth had grown proportionally. Edmund Harwick had married the daughter of a state senator, while Cornelius had begun construction on a mansion that would rival anything in Harrisburg. It was in this context of prosperity and respectability that the first disappearances began to attract notice. But in a town where workers came and went with the seasons, where industrial accidents were common, and where the immigrant population was viewed with suspicion by established residents, a few missing laborers barely merited mention in the local weekly newspaper. The very factors that made Millhaven a success story of American industry, its rapid growth, its efficient integration of business and government, its reliance on a vulnerable workforce, also made it the perfect setting for systematic evil to flourish undetected. The Harwick family had built more than just a grain mill. They had constructed a nearly impenetrable fortress of social position and economic power. What the good citizens of Millhaven didn't realize was that their town's prosperity was quite literally built on blood and bone, ground as fine as the flour that made their fortunes. To understand how the Harwick Mill operated its machinery of death for over 3 decades, one must first appreciate the elaborate facade that concealed its true purpose. The Harwicks had crafted a public image so compelling, so perfectly aligned with the values of industrial-era America, that even those who witnessed troubling signs found ways to rationalize them away. Josiah Harwick cultivated the persona of the benevolent patriarch. Each Sunday, he sat in the front pew of the Methodist church he'd helped establish, his deep baritone leading the congregation in hymns. He was known to slip coins to widows after service and had established a fund to provide school supplies for the children of his workers. When the Great Flood of 1841 damaged several worker tenements, Harwick personally supervised the reconstruction, even housing displaced families in his own warehouses. His sons played complementary roles in this carefully orchestrated deception. Edmund, the elder, served as the mill's public face, a progressive businessman who spoke at industrial conferences about efficiency and worker safety. He had installed what he claimed were the latest safety mechanisms around the grinding stones and instituted a system of warning bells to prevent accidents. Cornelius, meanwhile, managed the mill's charitable endeavors, organizing harvest festivals for workers and their families, complete with grain donations to those in need. The mill itself was maintained as a model of industrial order. Visitors, and there were many drawn by its reputation for innovation, were given carefully choreographed tour. They saw gleaming machinery, workers in clean aprons, and safety notices posted in multiple languages. The main grinding floor was kept spotless, with large windows providing ample light and ventilation. Edmund would proudly demonstrate the emergency shut-off mechanisms he'd designed, pulling levers that would immediately halt the massive stones. What visitors didn't see were the sub-basements, accessed through hidden doors in the maintenance areas. They didn't notice that certain night shift positions were filled exclusively by workers hand-picked by Cornelius, men with gambling debts or dark secrets that ensured their silence. They couldn't know that the elaborate bell system served a dual purpose, warning not just of mechanical dangers, but of approaching outsiders. The community's perception of the Harwicks was shaped by countless small gestures and grand performances. When Irish immigrant Michael O'Sullivan's daughter fell ill with scarlet fever, Josiah Harwick personally paid for Dr. Morton to attend her. When the widow Hanson couldn't afford burial costs for her husband, killed in a legitimate mill accident, the Harwicks covered all expenses and provided a modest pension. These acts of kindness were genuine in their effect, but calculated in their purpose, creating a network of grateful dependents who would never question their benefactors. Early warning signs were invariably explained away through this lens of benevolence. When workers occasionally vanished, Edmund would sorrowfully report that they had been caught stealing grain and dismissed, given coach fare to leave town rather than face prosecution. Another example of Harwick mercy. The fact that these thieves left behind their few possessions, even family members in some cases, was attributed to shame. The smell that sometimes emanated from the mill during night operations, a sickly sweet odor distinct from grain processing, was explained as experimental treatments to prevent weevil infestations. Edmund had even published a paper on innovative pest control methods in the Pennsylvania Agricultural Journal, lending scientific credibility to the lie. Dr. Elias Morton, the town physician, became an unwitting enabler of the Harwick's operations. A competent but unimaginative man, Morton had established his practice with a loan from Josiah Harwick and remained financially beholden to the family. When workers came to him with stories of strange sounds from the mill at night, sounds they described as almost human, Morton prescribed laudanum for their nerves and reminded them of the dangers of spreading rumors about their employers. Sheriff William Dunbar played a similar role. A former mill foreman who owed his position to Harwick influence, Dunbar genuinely believed in the family's righteousness. When concerned citizens occasionally reported missing workers, Dunbar's investigations were perfunctory. He accepted the mill's employment records without question, never noticing that certain names appeared and disappeared with suspicious regularity, or that the handwriting on these records always belonged to Cornelius Harwick. Perhaps the most tragic unwitting accomplice was Friedrich Zimmer, the German immigrant who operated the general store that served the mill district. Zimmer had noticed peculiarities in the mill's purchasing patterns, unusual quantities of lime, medical supplies typically used for restraints, and specialized cutting implements that had no obvious grain processing purpose. But Zimmer, who had fled political persecution in his homeland, had learned to mind his own business. The Harwicks were his best customers, and their patronage had allowed him to bring his entire extended family to America. The surface deception was so complete that when Agnes Murphy, an Irish washerwoman, claimed to have seen blood on grain sacks from the mill, she was dismissed as a hysteric. When she persisted, spreading her story in the tenements, she was quietly committed to the state asylum in Harrisburg for nervous exhaustion. The commitment papers bore Dr. Morton's signature and Sheriff Dunbar's seal. Even the mill's legitimate workers became part of the deception. Proud of their association with the region's most successful enterprise, they would defend their employers against any slight. The day shift workers genuinely believed they labored in an exemplary facility. They had no knowledge of what transpired in the depths of the mill during the night shifts, when the real work began. This masterfully constructed illusion would continue until that fateful night in November 1842, when a combination of circumstances would finally pierce the veil of respectability the Harwicks had so carefully woven. The unraveling of the Harwick Mill's gruesome secret began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a series of seemingly unconnected incidents that would eventually form a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The first crack in the facade appeared on September 15, 1842, when Jakob Steinberg, a German millwright hired to repair the auxiliary water wheel, became lost in the mill's labyrinthine lower levels. Steinberg, working alone during the dinner break, had followed what he thought was a maintenance corridor, but found himself in an area of the mill he'd never seen before. The air was thick with a cloying smell that made his stomach turn, nothing like the honest scent of grain dust he knew well. Following the faint light of his oil lamp, Steinberg discovered a room that defied explanation. Iron shackles hung from the walls at regular intervals, their surfaces stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The floor was covered in a strange, gritty substance that crunched beneath his boots. Most unsettling were the deep grooves carved into the wooden support beams, grooves that looked eerily like scratch marks made by human fingernails. Steinberg fled the room and reported his discovery to Edmund Harwick, expecting alarm and investigation. Instead, Edmund calmly explained that the room was used for restraining livestock brought in for illegal butchering by some of the night workers, a practice the Harwicks had recently discovered and were in the process of stopping. The shackles were for holding hogs, the stains were animal blood, and the scratches were made by workers sharpening their knives. Edmund thanked Steinberg for his diligence and gave him a substantial bonus for his discretion, asking him not to spread rumors that might damage the mill's reputation. The explanation seemed plausible enough, and Steinberg, grateful for the extra money, kept quiet. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The second incident occurred 6 weeks later, on the night of November 2, 1842. Margaret O'Brien, a young Irish woman who took in washing from the mill workers, made a delivery to the mill after dark, something she'd been specifically told never to do. Her husband had fallen ill, and she desperately needed the payment for her completed work. Knowing the night foreman, she thought she could quickly collect her fee and leave. As she approached the mill's side entrance, she heard sounds that froze her blood. A rhythmic grinding punctuated by what could only be human screams, muffled but unmistakable. Through a gap in the loading dock doors, she glimpsed a scene that would haunt her forever. Figures in leather aprons feeding something into the grinding mechanism, their movements methodical and practiced. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet, crushing sound that made her gorge rise. Margaret fled into the night, her washing abandoned. She told her husband what she'd seen, but he, burning with fever and dependent on the mill's charity for medicine, forbade her from speaking of it. When she confided in her priest, Father McKenna, himself beholden to the Harwicks for his church's funding, he told her she must have misunderstood what she'd seen. Industrial work was harsh, he reminded her, and perhaps she'd witnessed the processing of livestock. When she insisted on the human screams, he prescribed prayer and penance for bearing false witness. But Margaret O'Brien would not be silenced. She began asking questions among the other washerwomen, discovering that several had noticed peculiarities. Work clothes that came back with stains that weren't grain dust or machine oil, but something organic and foul. Leather aprons with what looked like human tissue caught in the seams. Mysterious injuries on night workers who claimed to have had accidents, but whose wounds looked more like defensive marks. It was these whispered conversations among the washerwomen that eventually reached the ears of Dr. Marcus Thornton, a young physician who had recently arrived in Millhaven to assist the aging Dr. Morton. Unlike Morton, Thornton had no financial ties to the Harwick family and possessed a sharp, analytical mind trained in the latest medical techniques at the University of Pennsylvania. Thornton had already begun to notice troubling patterns in his practice. An unusual number of workers from the mill complained of nightmares and nervous conditions. Several had come to him with similar stories of hearing things at the mill that couldn't be explained. Most disturbing, he'd treated 3 different men for nearly identical injuries. Deep lacerations on their arms that they claimed were from equipment malfunctions, but which looked suspiciously like restraint wounds. When Margaret O'Brien finally worked up the courage to approach him, bringing with her a leather apron she'd stolen from the wash pile, Thornton examined it with growing horror. Caught in the seams was not animal tissue, but what appeared to be human skin, complete with a partial fingerprint. More damning still, when he applied the latest chemical tests, he found traces of human blood of multiple types, far more than could be explained by industrial accidents. Thornton knew he needed more evidence before he could act. The Harwick's power in Millhaven was absolute, and accusations without proof would likely result in his own ruin. He began carefully documenting everything: the testimonies of workers, the physical evidence from clothing, the patterns of disappearances that seemed to spike during harvest season when transient workers were most numerous. His investigation led him to examine the mill's employment records, which he gained access to by claiming to need them for a public health survey. What he found chilled him. Over the past 4 years, more than 60 workers had been listed as departed without notice. All were single men without local family connections. All had worked night shifts. And all had vanished during the same lunar phase, the new moon, when nights were darkest. On the night of November 24, 1842, Thornton decided to see for himself what transpired in the Harwick Mill after dark. Hiding in a supply wagon, he managed to slip inside the compound undetected. What he witnessed in the following hours would test the limits of his sanity and medical training. Following the sounds of machinery to the lower levels, Thornton found himself looking through a ventilation grate into a vast underground chamber he was certain didn't appear on any official mill blueprint. The scene below defied comprehension. The massive grinding stones that processed innocent grain by day had been converted into an apparatus of systematic murder. Bodies, some still moving, were being fed into specially modified hoppers, while men in leather masks operated the machinery with practiced efficiency. But it was what happened to the remains that truly revealed the depths of the Harwick's depravity. The crushed bone and tissue weren't being disposed of. They were being carefully mixed with grain husks and compressed into blocks. Thornton watched in growing horror as these blocks were stacked in neat piles, labeled with dates and numbers in what appeared to be a grotesque inventory system. Unable to bear more, Thornton retreated, but not before accidentally knocking over a lamp in his haste. The crash alerted the workers below, and suddenly the mill erupted in activity. Bells rang out, not the safety bells Edmund Harwick had so proudly demonstrated, but a different sequence that sent leather-aproned figures racing through the tunnels. Thornton barely escaped with his life, pursued through the dark streets of Millhaven by men who knew the shadows far better than he. He made it to his residence only to find Sheriff Dunbar waiting for him, accompanied by Josiah Harwick himself. They had received reports, Dunbar explained, of a break-in at the mill. Several valuable equipment pieces were missing, and witnesses had seen someone matching Thornton's description fleeing the scene. But Thornton had anticipated this. Before his investigation, he had sent detailed letters to colleagues in Philadelphia and to his mentor at the university, explaining his suspicions and instructing them to demand an investigation if anything happened to him. With this insurance, he faced down Josiah Harwick and made his accusations directly. The old man's reaction was not what Thornton expected. Instead of denial or rage, Josiah Harwick smiled, a cold, terrible expression that belonged on no human face. "Doctor," he said quietly, "you have no idea what forces you're meddling with. This enterprise is bigger than you can imagine and far older than this mill. Walk away now, and you might live to see another sunrise." But Thornton stood firm. Within hours, he had roused several prominent citizens, including the Presbyterian minister who had long been suspicious of the Harwick's dominance, and Judge Harrison Clark, whose jurisdiction extended beyond Millhaven's borders. Together, armed and determined, they marched on the mill as dawn broke on November 25, 1842. What they found in the light of day would exceed even Thornton's darkest observations. The mill's terrible secret was about to be exposed, but the full horror of the Harwick operation was beyond anything the good people of Millhaven could have imagined. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. When I first discovered these archived records in the Pennsylvania Historical Society, I had to stop reading several times just to process what I was seeing. The systematic nature of what the Harwicks had created goes beyond anything we typically associate with 19th-century crime. Please, if you're finding this investigation as compelling as I am, hit that like button and share this video. The more people who know about these buried histories, the harder it becomes for similar horrors to hide in plain sight. And trust me, what Dr. Thornton and the others discovered when they entered that mill in the dawn light of November 25th will challenge everything you thought you knew about industrial-era America. We're about to discover together what happens when the machinery of progress literally runs on human suffering. The testimonies from that morning, sealed in court records for over a century, paint a picture so disturbing that several of the investigators required medical treatment for nervous shock. Are you ready to descend with them into the grinding heart of the Harwick Mill? Let's discover together what horrors await in the full light of day. The morning of November 25, 1842, broke cold and gray over Millhaven, fitting weather for the horrors about to be uncovered. Dr. Marcus Thornton led the group of investigators through the mill's main entrance at 6:47 a.m., accompanied by Judge Harrison Clark, Reverend James Patterson of the Presbyterian Church, and 6 armed deputies from neighboring counties, men with no connections to the Harwick family. What struck them first was the silence. The mill, which should have been preparing for the day's work, stood empty. The great water wheel continued its endless rotation, but no workers manned their stations. Edmund and Cornelius Harwick were nowhere to be found, though Josiah waited for them in his office, seated behind his mahogany desk as if receiving ordinary visitors. "Gentlemen," the elder Harwick said calmly, "I assume you've come about the doctor's accusations. You'll find everything you need in the lower levels. I've dismissed the workers for their own safety." His composure was unnerving, the attitude of a man who had accepted his fate, or who believed himself beyond earthly justice. Judge Clark ordered 2 deputies to secure Josiah, while the rest of the party descended into the mill's depths. Dr. Thornton led them through the concealed door he'd discovered, down stone steps that grew damper and colder with each level. The smell hit them at the first landing, a mixture of decay, industrial chemicals, and something else, something fundamentally wrong that triggered primal revulsion. The first chamber they entered contained what Thornton would later describe in his official testimony as an abattoir designed with mathematical precision. Iron frameworks held human remains in various stages of processing. Bodies were suspended from hooks along one wall, sorted by size and physical condition. Each corpse bore a tag with numbers and notations in Cornelius Harwick's meticulous handwriting. Dates of acquisition, physical specifications, and cryptic symbols whose meaning would only become clear later. Reverend Patterson collapsed at the sight, requiring assistance from the deputies. One body, that of a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, showed signs of recent death, perhaps only hours old. The precision of the wounds suggested medical knowledge. Tendons severed to prevent struggle, specific nerve clusters targeted to maximize pain while maintaining consciousness. The next chamber revealed the true scope of the operation. Here, the investigators found the grinding apparatus Thornton had glimpsed through the grate. But daylight and closer inspection revealed details that his nighttime observation had missed. The standard grain hoppers had been modified with restraint mechanisms, iron clamps designed to hold human limbs. Channels carved into the stone floor directed blood away from the grinding stones to collection vats. Judge Clark, a veteran of the War of 1812 who had seen battlefield carnage, later testified that nothing in his experience compared to the calculated efficiency of this murder machine. This was not madness, he stated in court records. This industry applied to evil, but it was the discovery of the processing rooms that revealed the full horror of the Harwick operation. Beyond the killing floor, they found chambers where the ground remains were mixed with grain husks and compressed into blocks using modified pressing equipment. These blocks, stamped with dates going back to 1838, lined the walls in neat stacks. A ledger left open on a work table recorded each batch with the same attention to detail used for legitimate mill operations. The ledger's entries were chilling in their banality. November 3, 1842. Batch 447, 3 units processed, yield satisfactory. October 19, 1842, batch 441, 2 units, note. Preprocessing time increased for optimal consistency. September 28, 1842, batch 438, 4 units, experimental mixture with white wheat shows promise. Dr. Thornton's medical training proved invaluable in understanding what they were seeing. The bones hadn't simply been ground for disposal. They had been processed to specific consistencies and mixed with grain in precise ratios. Chemical equipment in an adjacent room suggested experimentation with preservation methods and potentially other purposes that defied immediate comprehension. In a locked cabinet, they found correspondence that elevated the horror from mere serial murder to something far more sinister. Letters bearing postmarks from Baltimore, New York, and even London discussed shipments, quality standards, and payment schedules. The ground human remains weren't just being disposed of. They were being distributed through a network that reached across the Atlantic. One letter, dated August 15, 1842, from a Mr. Blackwood in Baltimore, was particularly explicit. The last shipment exceeded expectations. Our clients particularly appreciated the consistency of the product. Please confirm the ability to fulfill winter orders at discussed quantities. The most damning evidence came from Cornelius Harwick's personal office, hidden within the mill complex. Here, investigators found detailed anatomical drawings, chemical formulas, and what appeared to be research notes spanning decades. The drawings showed human bodies marked with cutting lines like butcher's diagrams, annotated with notes about optimal processing methods. But nothing prepared the investigators for the discovery of the holding chambers. Behind a series of locked iron doors, they found 12 people still alive, workers who had been selected for processing but not yet fed to the machinery. These survivors, ranging in age from 16 to 34, had been kept in conditions that defied description. Each was shackled in a narrow stone cell, showing signs of systematic starvation and torture designed to prepare them for processing. Among the survivors was Thomas McKenna, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant who had been missing for 6 days. Despite his ordeal, McKenna managed to provide crucial testimony. He described how night shift workers were selected based on their lack of local connections, lured to the lower levels with promises of extra pay for special work, then overpowered and imprisoned. He had watched 3 fellow prisoners taken to the grinding room and had heard their final moments. "They made us watch," McKenna testified, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said it was important we understood what was coming. Said fear made the product better." This detail corresponded with notes in Cornelius's journal that discussed the effect of various emotional states on the quality of the final product. The Harwicks hadn't just been killing. They had been conducting experiments in human suffering with scientific methodology. As the investigators continued their grim inventory, they found evidence of the operation's longevity. Carbon dating would later confirm that some of the compressed blocks in the deepest storage areas dated back to 1838, when the mill was first constructed. Construction records, previously thought lost in the 1842 fire, were discovered in a hidden vault. They showed that the mill's terrible purpose had been planned from the beginning, with the legitimate grain processing serving as cover for the underground chambers. Perhaps most disturbing was a room that appeared to be a grotesque museum. Glass cases contained specimens, preserved samples from victims showing unusual physical characteristics. Labels indicated dates, origins, and notes about processing results. One case contained the preserved hands of a victim, identified only as Subject 12, exceptional bone density. See batch 289 for processing notes. The scale of the operation became clearer as investigators tallied the evidence. Based on the ledgers and physical remains, they estimated that between 200 and 300 people had been murdered and processed since the mill's opening. The victims had been selected with care: transient workers, immigrants without family connections, vagrants, and others whose disappearances would attract minimal attention. By midday, word of the discoveries had spread through Millhaven. Crowds gathered outside the mill, initially skeptical but growing increasingly horrified as investigators emerged with physical evidence. Several prominent citizens who had defended the Harwicks fell to their knees in the street, overwhelmed by their complicity in enabling such evil. Dr. Morton, the town physician who had dismissed so many concerns, arrived at the scene and, upon viewing the evidence, suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. He would spend the remainder of his days in an asylum, tormented by the knowledge of how many victims he had failed to save. As the full scope of the horror became clear, one question dominated: how had this been possible? The answer lay not just in the Harwick's methods, but in the network of compliance, willful blindness, and active participation that had sustained their operation. The mill's legitimate workers genuinely knew nothing of the night operations, but the night shift consisted entirely of men bound to the Harwicks by debt, blackmail, or darker compulsions. Several of these night workers were captured trying to flee town. Their testimonies would reveal that some had been forced to participate after witnessing the fate of those who refused. Others, more disturbingly, had been willing participants, drawn by payments far exceeding normal wages and by something darker: a fascination with the systematic reduction of human beings to industrial products. But even as the investigators cataloged the horrors of the mill, they realized they were only seeing part of a larger picture. The correspondence with buyers, the references to the old work in Josiah's papers, and symbols found throughout the complex that matched no known industrial markings all pointed to something beyond mere serial murder for profit. As Judge Clark would note in his final report, "We have uncovered an evil that wears the mask of industry, but whose roots reach into depths I dare not contemplate. The Harwick Mill was not the beginning of this horror, nor, I fear, will it be the end." The sun was setting by the time the last of the evidence was cataloged and removed. 12 survivors had been rescued and were receiving medical treatment. 3 members of the night crew were in custody. But Edmund and Cornelius Harwick had vanished, leaving behind only their meticulous records and the grinding machinery that had served their terrible purpose. Josiah Harwick, still seated calmly in his office, smiled as they led him away in shackles. His only comment: "You think you've ended something here today? You've only scratched the surface of an enterprise centuries in the making. The work will continue, with or without the Harwicks." The arrest of Josiah Harwick should have marked the end of Millhaven's nightmare. But within days of the mill's closure, it became apparent that the investigators had stumbled onto something far more extensive than one family's madness. The first indication came when Federal Marshal Samuel Crenshaw arrived from Philadelphia with orders to assume control of the investigation. Orders that Judge Clark found suspiciously vague about which federal authority had issued them. Marshal Crenshaw, a thin man with dead eyes and an unsettling habit of constantly checking his pocket watch, immediately attempted to confiscate all evidence and transfer Josiah Harwick to federal custody. When Judge Clark refused, citing jurisdictional concerns, Crenshaw produced documents suggesting that the Harwick Mill investigation touched on matters of national industrial security. The papers bore authentic-looking seals, but something about them troubled Clark, perhaps the fact that they referred to government departments he'd never heard of. Dr. Thornton, meanwhile, had begun analyzing the correspondence found in the mill. Working with Professor Benjamin Rush at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the few men he trusted, he discovered that the network of buyers extended far beyond what they'd initially suspected. The coded references in the letters, when decoded using a cipher found in Cornelius's desk, revealed shipment destinations that included a processing facility in Baltimore operating under the cover of a fertilizer plant, multiple addresses in New York's industrial district, all registered to companies that existed only on paper, 6 locations in London, Manchester, and Liverpool connected to textile mills. Most disturbingly, 3 addresses in Washington, D.C., including one perilously close to the Capitol building. The investigation took a darker turn when Thornton received an unmarked package at his residence. Inside was a daguerreotype of his sister in Boston, taken without her knowledge, along with a note: "Cease your inquiries or she joins the work." Similar threats reached Judge Clark and Reverend Patterson. 2 of the deputies who had participated in the raid reported being followed by men in dark coats who vanished whenever confronted. Despite the intimidation, the investigators pressed on. They discovered that the Harwick Mill was not unique, but part of a network called the Continuation, a name that appeared repeatedly in coded documents. References to the Continuation dated back decades, with mentions of similar operations in Europe predating American independence. Thomas McKenna, recovering from his ordeal, provided crucial information. During his captivity, he had overheard Edmund and Cornelius discussing the other sites and the need to warn them. He remembered specific phrases. "The Baltimore stones must keep grinding, and London expects the winter shipment regardless." Most chilling was Cornelius's comment that "Father's capture means nothing. We are one tentacle of 1,000. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Friedrich Zimmer, the German shopkeeper who had supplied the mill, approached Thornton in secret. Overcome with guilt and fearing for his soul, Zimmer revealed that he had known more than he'd admitted. The unusual supplies hadn't just gone to the Harwick Mill. He had received orders to ship identical items to addresses in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati. All orders used the same coded language and payment methods. Zimmer also revealed something that recontextualized the entire investigation. In 1839, before the Harwick Mill was fully operational, he had been approached by a man claiming to represent European industrial interests. This man, who spoke German with an aristocratic accent, had offered Zimmer an exclusive supply contract if he agreed to ask no questions and keep meticulous records. The man had shown Zimmer a ring bearing a peculiar symbol, the same symbol investigators had found carved throughout the mill's hidden chambers. Armed with this information, Thornton and Clark dispatched trusted investigators to the other cities Zimmer had mentioned. What they found defied belief. In Baltimore, the Chesapeake Rendering Works operated a facility nearly identical to the Harwick Mill's hidden chambers. In Pittsburgh, the Allegheny Iron Foundry had a secret annex where the special processing occurred. Each location showed the same methodical approach, the same symbols, the same coded ledgers. But it was the discovery in Cincinnati that revealed the true scope of the Continuation. Hidden in the basement of what appeared to be a legitimate slaughterhouse, investigators found not just processing facilities, but a library. Hundreds of volumes in multiple languages dating back centuries. The books contained anatomical diagrams, chemical formulas, and philosophical treatises that spoke of transforming human essence into industrial sacrament. One volume, written in Latin and dated 1672, described the great work of reduction, a process by which human remains, properly prepared and processed, could serve purposes beyond mere disposal. The text spoke of buyers who used the product for everything from agricultural enhancement to more esoteric purposes that the investigators struggled to comprehend. References to feeding the machines and lubricating the gears of progress took on new, horrifying meanings. The resistance to the investigation intensified as its scope expanded. Judge Clark's home was burned while he was away. The fire department arrived suspiciously late. Dr. Thornton was attacked by 3 men while leaving the hospital. Only the intervention of off-duty police officers saved him. Reverend Patterson received a package containing a human finger and a note suggesting his daughter, away at school, was being watched. More troubling were the official obstacles. When Clark attempted to file federal charges, he found that key documents had vanished from courthouse files. Witnesses began recanting testimonies, claiming they had been mistaken or coerced. The prosecutor assigned to the case suddenly resigned, citing family obligations, and his replacement seemed curiously uninterested in pursuing leads beyond the Harwick family. The investigation revealed that the Continuation had operated in America for at least 50 years, possibly longer. References were found to a Carolina operation in the 1790s, and New Amsterdam processing dating to the Dutch colonial period. Each iteration had been discovered and shut down, only to re-emerge elsewhere under new management, but following the same fundamental patterns. The network's influence reached into unexpected places. When investigators arrested the night foreman of the Baltimore facility, they found among his possessions letters from a U.S. senator, a federal judge, and two prominent industrialists, all discussing the work in coded but clearly knowledgeable terms. Bank records showed regular payments from companies that, when traced, led to dead ends or businesses that existed only on paper. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of recruitment methods. The continuation didn't merely exploit existing workers. It actively created conditions to generate victims. Documents detailed plans to encourage immigration from specific regions, to establish tenements that would foster transients, and to support political policies that would create a steady supply of society's expendable members. Edmund and Cornelius Harwick remained at large despite extensive manhunts. Sightings placed them in Toronto, New Orleans, and Mexico City, always one step ahead of pursuers. More troubling were reports of new facilities beginning operation shortly after their appearance in these cities, suggesting they were not fleeing but expanding. The 12 survivors from the Harwick Mill provided a final, crucial piece of information. Each reported being told during their captivity that they were part of something ancient and necessary, that their sacrifice would feed the future. Several mentioned that their captors had spoken of buyers who were not entirely human, a detail investigators initially dismissed as trauma-induced delusion, until similar claims emerged from survivors in Baltimore and Cincinnati. As 1843 dawned, the investigation had expanded beyond anything Clark or Thornton had imagined. They had uncovered not just a network of serial killers, but an entire shadow industry with its own economy, philosophy, and terrifying purpose. Federal authorities finally took official control of the investigation, but their first act was to seal all evidence and silence witnesses under threat of sedition charges. Judge Clark's final report, submitted before federal intervention, concluded, "We have uncovered an evil that operates not in darkness, but in the very machinery of our civilization." The continuation is aptly named. It continues regardless of our efforts, adapting, evolving, and feeding on progress itself. God help us, for I fear we have only hastened its metamorphosis into something more terrible. The gears of justice would grind slowly, and as the investigators would soon learn, the continuation had survived centuries by understanding one simple truth. Progress demands sacrifice, and there are always those willing to provide it, and those willing to pay for it. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of human depravity, the investigation reveals something even more terrifying. This wasn't isolated madness, but an organized system operating across continents. The fact that similar facilities were discovered from Baltimore to London suggests we're looking at one of history's most extensive criminal conspiracies. If this investigation is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please share this video before it's too late. YouTube has already flagged this content twice for disturbing historical documentation, and I'm not sure how long it will stay up. To my true crime family, you brave souls who have made it this far, we're about to see how the justice system of 1843 handled crimes that challenged their very understanding of evil. Did the survivors find justice? Did the continuation truly end, or did it simply evolve? Drop a comment if you think operations like this could exist today under different guises. Sometimes the most terrifying truth is that evil doesn't disappear. It just adapts to new times. Let's discover together what happened when 19th century law tried to prosecute a horror that had thrived for centuries. The trial of Josiah Harwick began on March 6, 1843, in the Dauphin County Courthouse in Harrisburg, moved from Millhaven due to concerns about local bias and security. What should have been a straightforward prosecution for mass murder instead became a legal labyrinth that exposed the limitations of 19th century justice when confronted with organized evil. The prosecution, led by State Attorney General James Buchanan, later to become president, faced immediate challenges. Key evidence had mysteriously vanished from secured storage. Witnesses who had provided detailed testimonies suddenly developed memory problems or disappeared entirely. 3 jurors had to be dismissed when investigators discovered they had received substantial payments from unknown sources. Josiah Harwick, represented by a team of Philadelphia's finest lawyers, whose fees far exceeded any wealth the family had publicly declared, maintained an eerie calm throughout proceedings. He admitted to knowledge of the deaths, but claimed they were part of a religious practice protected under freedom of worship, a defense that would have been laughable if not for the documents his lawyers produced. These papers, allegedly centuries old and bearing the seals of European nobility, outlined what they called the ancient rite of industrial transmutation. Harwick's lawyers argued that their client genuinely believed he was performing a sacred duty, transforming the base material of humanity into something that served a higher purpose. The defense was absurd, yet it introduced enough confusion to complicate what should have been a simple case. The testimony of survivors proved powerful but problematic. Thomas McKenna and others described their ordeals in harrowing detail, but defense attorneys seized on inconsistencies born of trauma. When survivors mentioned being told they would feed the future, or described their captors' references to inhuman buyers, the defense painted them as delusional, their memories tainted by fear and laudanum administered during recovery. The physical evidence remained overwhelming: the modified machinery, the human remains, the meticulous ledgers. But Harwick's lawyers argued that Edmund and Cornelius, conveniently absent, had acted without their father's knowledge, using his legitimate business as cover for their own perversions. They produced forged documents suggesting Josiah had been attempting to stop his sons when the authorities intervened. Most frustrating for prosecutors was the federal intervention that had sealed away the most damning evidence: the correspondence revealing the international network, the ancient texts describing the great work, the proof of the continuation's scope. Federal Marshal Crenshaw testified that this evidence was too sensitive for public disclosure and could compromise ongoing investigations. When pressed, he claimed issues of international trade and diplomatic relations were at stake. The trial took a sensational turn when Dr. Elias Morton, the town physician who had enabled the Harwicks through his willful blindness, was brought from the asylum to testify. His appearance shocked the courtroom. In just months he had aged decades, his hair white, his hands constantly trembling. His testimony veered between lucid recollections and raving about the sound of grinding that never stops and buyers who wear human faces but aren't human underneath. Morton's breakdown on the stand, screaming about seeing ground bones in his food and feeling phantom fingers in his medicine bottles, should have emphasized the horror of the crimes. Instead, the defense used it to suggest that the entire case was built on the fantasies of disturbed minds, a form of mass hysteria that had infected Millhaven. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury delivered a verdict that satisfied no one. Josiah Harwick was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, but acquitted of the direct murder charges due to lack of concrete evidence linking him to specific deaths. He was sentenced to 20 years in Eastern State Penitentiary, a term that seemed insultingly light given the scale of the horrors. The manhunt for Edmund and Cornelius Harwick became one of the largest in American history, yet yielded nothing. Reports placed them in a dozen cities simultaneously. Ships' manifests were checked, borders were watched, but the brothers had vanished as completely as many of their victims. More troubling were reports from Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean of new industrial facilities, whose operators bore a striking resemblance to the fugitive brothers. The night shift workers who had participated in the murders faced swifter justice. Of the 8 men captured, 6 were convicted and hanged for murder. 2 others were found dead in their cells before trial, apparent suicides, though the cell doors had been locked from the outside and no means of self-harm were found. Their deaths ensured that many operational details of the mill died with them. The fate of the 12 survivors varied tragically. 3 died within months of their rescue, their bodies simply unable to recover from the systematic abuse. 4 others were committed to asylums, driven mad by their experiences and the knowledge that their testimonies had been dismissed or ignored. Thomas McKenna, the most articulate witness, was found dead in an alley in Philadelphia 6 months after the trial. Officially a robbery, though nothing was taken, and his body showed signs of the same precise wounds inflicted in the mill. Only 5 survivors managed to build new lives, and they did so by fleeing far from Pennsylvania. 2 went west to California, 1 returned to Ireland, and 2 disappeared so completely that even well-meaning investigators couldn't find them. Each reported continued harassment, strange men watching their homes, packages containing grain mixed with bone fragments, notes warning them against speaking of their experiences. The Harwick Mill itself became a point of contention. The building should have been demolished immediately, but legal challenges from mysterious claimants delayed action. During this limbo, the mill burned to the ground on November 25, 1843, exactly 1 year after its secrets were exposed. Fire investigators found evidence of arson, but also discovered that someone had been inside during the blaze, apparently attempting to restart the grinding machinery. No remains were found, but locals reported hearing screams from within the inferno that couldn't have come from empty buildings. The promised reforms proved limited and temporary. The Pennsylvania legislature passed the Mill Safety Act of 1843, mandating regular inspections of industrial facilities, but the inspectors were often the same locals who had enabled the Harwicks. Within 5 years, most provisions had been weakened or repealed under pressure from industrial interests who claimed excessive regulation would harm economic growth. More troubling was what didn't happen. The federal investigation into the continuation, despite early promises, produced no public findings. Marshal Crenshaw disappeared 3 months after the trial, his office claiming he had been reassigned to territorial duties out west. The evidence he had confiscated was declared lost in a warehouse fire that conveniently destroyed only the sections containing Harwick-related materials. Dr. Marcus Thornton, the hero who had exposed the mill, found his medical practice destroyed by whisper campaigns, suggesting he had imagined or exaggerated the horrors. Former patients avoided him, colleagues distanced themselves, and medical journals rejected his attempts to publish accounts of what he'd discovered. He spent his final years trying to investigate other potential continuation sites, funding his research by selling everything he owned. Thornton's journals, discovered after his death in 1851, contained disturbing findings. He had identified 17 facilities across the United States showing similar patterns to the Harwick Mill: unusual employee turnover, mysterious night operations, connections to the same network of shell companies. His attempts to interest authorities had been met with silence or active discouragement. His final entry read, "They have not stopped. They have merely learned to hide better. The grinding continues, and we have taught them our weaknesses." Judge Harrison Clark retired from the bench shortly after the trial, officially due to health concerns. Privately, he confided to family that he could no longer trust the justice system after seeing how easily it had been manipulated. He spent his remaining years warning anyone who would listen about the continuation, earning a reputation as a paranoid eccentric. His death in 1847 was attributed to heart failure, though his housekeeper swore she had seen men in dark coats leaving his study the night he died. Perhaps most disturbing were the economic effects, or rather, the lack thereof. Several industries that had relied on shipments from the Harwick Mill and its sister facilities showed no disruption in their operations. The fertilizer companies in Baltimore continued to thrive. The textile mills in England reported no shortage of the special treatments that made their fabrics so durable. Either they had found new suppliers with suspicious speed, or the continuation had never truly ceased operations. In Millhaven itself, the town struggled to recover from the revelation of the horror in its midst. Property values plummeted, businesses closed, and many families fled. Within a decade, what had been a thriving industrial center became a ghost town. Travelers reported avoiding the ruins of the mill, claiming to hear grinding sounds on quiet nights and to see lights in basements that had supposedly been filled with concrete. The 5 members of the Harwick night crew who had escaped capture were never found, despite rewards that would have made anyone rich. Occasional reports surfaced of men matching their descriptions working at industrial facilities in distant states, always vanishing before investigators arrived. More troubling were reports that they hadn't fled but had been recruited, that the continuation valued experienced workers who had proven their willingness to participate in the great work. The official record of the Harwick Mill case was sealed by federal order in 1845, not to be opened for a century. When researchers finally gained access in 1945, they found many documents missing or redacted. What remained was enough to confirm the basic facts, but not enough to trace the broader network. Conveniently absent were any documents that might identify the continuation's other operations or its leadership beyond the Harwick family. Josiah Harwick served only 7 years of his 20-year sentence. He was found dead in his cell on Christmas morning, 1850, apparently of natural causes. Guards reported that he had seemed in good spirits the night before, speaking of rejoining the work and saying his sacrifice had been accepted. His body showed no signs of violence, but prison officials noted that it seemed unusually desiccated, as if something had drained all moisture from his tissues. He was buried in an unmarked grave, location unknown. The Harwick case officially ended with Josiah's death, but the questions it raised would linger for generations. How extensive was the continuation? Who were the buyers that drove such systematic evil? And most disturbing of all, if they had operated successfully for centuries before discovery, and if the investigation had been so thoroughly sabotaged, what made anyone think they had actually stopped? These questions would haunt the survivors and investigators for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case was how quickly society chose to forget. Within a generation, the Harwick Mill had become a legend, its horrors dismissed as exaggeration, its victims reduced to statistics. The grinding wheels of progress turned on, and few wondered what might be feeding them. The Harwick Mill tragedy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of industrialization and the human capacity for systematic evil. What happened in Millhaven wasn't the product of individual madness, but of a system that transformed human beings into resources, grinding them as efficiently as grain. The most terrifying aspect isn't the barbarity of the acts, but the banality with which they were administered. Ledgers and receipts documenting murder with the same dispassion as wheat shipments. The case reveals how evil thrives not in darkness, but in the machinery of everyday life. The Harwicks weren't outcasts operating from society's margins. They were pillars of their community, their respectability serving as both camouflage and enabler. Every institution that should have protected the vulnerable, law enforcement, medicine, religion, government, was either complicit or willfully blind. The system didn't fail. It operated exactly as designed, protecting those with power while consuming those without. Consider what the continuation understood that we still struggle to acknowledge. Modern society creates categories of expendable people. The immigrants, transients, and poor who fed the mill's machinery were chosen precisely because their disappearances would hardly ripple the surface of respectable society. The Harwicks didn't create this vulnerability. They merely exploited a dehumanization already embedded in the industrial system. The speed with which the case was buried speaks to another uncomfortable truth. The federal seizure of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, the systematic sabotage of investigations. These weren't aberrations but standard responses to threats against established power. The continuation survived for centuries not through supernatural means, but through understanding that institutions protect themselves above all else. Why did this story remain hidden for so long? The official records were sealed until 1945, then resealed during the Cold War under national security provisions. When finally released in the 1970s, key documents had vanished. It took decades of research, cross-referencing survivor accounts with industrial records and international shipping manifests, to piece together the full narrative. Even now, certain aspects remain classified, supposedly to protect trade secrets of companies